The history of humanity's creation as documented in the oldest texts on Earth does not begin with a romantic act of divine inspiration, but with the brutal and systemic crisis of divine labor. To understand why the architects of civilization ultimately turned against their own creation, we must first analyze the rigid and uncompromising divine hierarchy that governed ancient Mesopotamia long before the first human was fashioned from the clay of the earth. This hierarchy was a complex web of power dynamics, most notably preserved in the Enuma Elish, a 7-tablet epic that reveals the brutal origins of cosmic order and the necessity of human existence. Within this divine genealogy, the Anunnaki emerged as the Supreme Council of Gods, a term literally meaning those of royal blood or princely offspring. At the absolute apex of this structure stood Anu, the paramount deity and ruler of the heavens, whose court served as the model for all future human kingship. However, the practical day-to-day governance of the cosmos and the physical earth fell to Anu's sons Enlil and Enki, whose contrasting domains and personalities would drive the tension that eventually led to the birth of humanity. The labor required to maintain the cosmic infrastructure was staggering in its scope and physical demand. The younger gods, known in the records as the Igi, served as the primary workforce, tasked with the endless toil of maintaining irrigation canals, temple complexes, and the very foundations of the earth. For 40 years, the Igi bore the burden of this labor, digging the massive channels of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers to ensure the fertility of the land and the nourishment of the elder gods. These younger deities were not mere servants. They were celestial beings who spent their days carrying heavy baskets of earth and maintaining the complex infrastructure that kept the universe functioning. Cuneiform administrative texts from various temples revealed the staggering bureaucracy required to track this divine labor. With elaborate record-keeping systems that monitored every offering and every hour of work performed by the Igi. Eventually, the physical and psychological strain of this endless toil reached a breaking point, leading to a rebellion that would paralyze the heavens and force a radical rethinking of the cosmic order. The rebellion of the Igi was not a disorganized riot, but a calculated and collective strike action that reflects the gravity of their exhaustion. The Atrahasis epic describes the moment when the younger gods threw down their tools and set fire to their work baskets surrounding the temple of Enlil at Nippur in a direct act of defiance. Their torches illuminated the night as they demanded immediate relief from the degrading manual labor that they believed was beneath their divine dignity. This work stoppage threatened to destroy the fundamental operations of the universe, from the flooding of the rivers to the seasonal cycles that govern the earth. Enlil, the god of wind and storm, initially reacted with characteristic authoritarianism and rage. He interpreted the strike as simple insubordination rather than a legitimate grievance threatening to unleash devastating floods and storms upon the rebellious Igi. Archaeological excavations at Nippur, the religious center of Mesopotamia, reveal the extraordinary scale of the temple complexes that the Igi were forced to maintain. The Akur temple complex, which served as Enlil's primary dwelling, was a massive administrative hub that required constant physical upkeep. The Igi's complaint was simple yet profound. The burden was too great and the toil was endless. The standoff between Enlil and the Igi created a crisis that the elder gods could not ignore. Anu, recognizing that brute force would not resolve a problem rooted in the social structure of the gods, called for a formal assembly to address the crisis. This assembly convened in the magnificent celestial hall of Anu, where the 50 great gods gathered to deliberate on the future of labor and the stability of the cosmos. It was during this period of unprecedented tension that the god Enki proposed a solution that would forever change the course of history. Enki, the master of wisdom and craftsmanship who ruled the subterranean freshwater ocean known as the Abzu, emerged as humanity's protector and greatest strategist. Recognizing that the Igi could no longer be forced to work, he proposed the creation of a new species that could assume the burden of divine labor while remaining permanently subservient to godly authority. This proposal met with significant resistance, particularly from Enlil, who viewed the creation of intelligent beings as a potential threat to divine supremacy. The debate within the divine assembly was fierce, with some gods arguing that mortals would eventually multiply beyond control and disturb the cosmic peace, while others maintained that manual labor was beneath the dignity of any celestial being. The technical specifications for this new creature were precise and required a balance of earthly and divine elements. Enki suggested fashioning these beings from clay, the fundamental substance of the earth formed from the primordial waters. However, clay alone would not be enough to create a worker capable of understanding complex commands and maintaining sophisticated infrastructure. The solution required the ultimate sacrifice, the death of a god whose blood and flesh would provide the divine spark necessary for consciousness. The selection of the deity, Wee-Ilu, for this sacrifice was not arbitrary. He was a god associated with rebellion and chaos, and his essence would provide the drive and intelligence required for work, but also the rebellious spirit that would eventually lead to humanity's own defiance. Enki himself wielded the sacrificial knife, collecting the divine blood to be mixed with the clay of the Abzu in proportions that required precise calculation to achieve the proper balance of mortal and immortal. The legal and administrative infrastructure of the Sumerian city-states was built upon the memory of this divine labor crisis. The Sumerian king list begins with the statement that kingship descended from heaven, establishing that the power to organize human labor was a divine mandate granted to mortals to fulfill the needs of the gods. Archaeological evidence from major temple sites, like the Ziggurat of Nana, reveals the enormous human workforce that was eventually required to maintain these divine establishments, corroborating the textual claims that the gods' demand for service far exceeded what celestial beings alone could provide. This interconnection between divine needs and human governance created a system where the gods served as judges and arbitrators, while humans functioned as the hands that maintained the physical world. As the divine assembly finalized the protocols for human creation, they were effectively signing a contract with a species that did not yet exist. They were solving their labor problem by introducing mortality, suffering, and potential chaos into their perfect cosmic order. The decision to create humanity was a radical gamble, a response to a labor strike that had nearly torn the heavens apart. This pivotal moment marked the end of the exclusive rule of the gods and the beginning of a symbiotic relationship that would define Mesopotamian civilization for thousands of years. The Iggy were relieved of their baskets, but the burden of the earth was transferred to the shoulders of a new creature fashioned from clay and the blood of a rebel god, a creature designed to serve, yet born from the essence of defiance. The transition from the heated political debates of the divine assembly to the sterile and highly controlled environment of the House of Fashioning in Eridu marked the beginning of a rigorous biological engineering project. This was not a moment of mystical conjuring, but a systematic, experimental process conducted by two of the Anunnaki's most brilliant technical minds, Enki, the god of wisdom and liquid essences, and Ninmah, the mother goddess whose expertise in birth and physical formation was unsurpassed among the survivor elite. Their laboratory, described in the ancient tablets as a chamber within Enki's temple, was equipped with the sophisticated infrastructure required for large-scale genetic and biological manipulation, featuring walls lined with birthing bricks and an atmosphere charged with the incantations of creation, which we now understand as complex operational sequences and genetic activation codes. The process began with the careful selection of the primary biological matrix, referred to in the records as the clay of the Abzu. This material was not common mud, but a specific mineral and organic compound found in the freshwater depths of Enki's subterranean domain, chosen for its unique malleability and its high compatibility with divine biological markers. However, the clay was merely the carrier for the most critical component, the divine essence or blood of the sacrificed deity, Wee-Ilu. This biological sacrifice provided the essential genetic spark required for human consciousness and independent intelligence. The Atrahasis epic provides meticulous details on the preparation of this mixture, emphasizing that the divine essence had to be purified, balanced, and mixed with the earthly clay in proportions that required precise mathematical calculation to achieve the desired result. The experimental nature of the human creation project became painfully evident through a documented series of failures that the cuneiform tablets categorize as the prototypes of Ninmah. These were not accidents of nature, but the predictable results of an evolving technical understanding regarding the delicate balance between celestial essence and terrestrial matter. Ninmah's first attempts, preserved in fragmentary tablets from Assur, produced beings that were biologically viable but functionally useless for the Anunnaki's specific labor requirements. One early prototype was described as a being with an excessive concentration of divine essence. While it possessed high spiritual awareness and could perceive the divine realm, it lacked the physical density and muscular structure necessary for heavy labor. These proto-humans spent their time in meditation and worship, but they could not grasp tools or understand the practical commands required for maintenance work. Conversely, other experiments by the mother goddess swung too far toward earthly materiality, producing beings of immense physical strength, but lacking the cognitive capacity to follow complex instructions. These beings could perform simple, repetitive movements, but they were unable to manage the sophisticated irrigation systems or understand the logistical complexities of urban civilization. Some prototypes possessed normal intelligence but were found to be sterile, unable to reproduce, and therefore useless for establishing a sustainable, long-term workforce. The most disturbing failures documented in the Neo-Assyrian medical texts involve beings with mismatched divine and earthly elements that produced grotesque hybrid characteristics, such as multiple limbs or consciousness that flickered between divine awareness and animalistic instinct. Each of these discarded experiments was carefully analyzed by Enki and Ninmah to determine exactly where the ratios of divine blood to earthly clay had been miscalculated. As the pressure from the divine assembly mounted and the Igi continued their refusal to work, Enki and Ninmah intensified their collaboration to refine their biological protocols. The breakthrough came when Enki realized that for a human being to be both intelligent enough to serve and subservient enough to control, the divine essence needed to be distributed unevenly throughout the clay matrix. He proposed concentrating the spark of Wi'ilu within the head and the heart, the centers of logic, language, and emotion, while keeping the extremities and the rest of the body predominantly composed of the stable, earthly clay substance. This strategic distribution of genetic material allowed for the creation of a being capable of abstract thought, creativity, and the understanding of law, while its fundamental physical needs ensured it remained dependent upon the god's infrastructure for food and shelter. The successful human prototype that emerged from this collaborative effort, the Adamu, represented a masterpiece of biological compromise and unprecedented complexity. It possessed the manual dexterity to handle specialized tools, the endurance to work long hours in the Mesopotamian sun, and the cognitive ability to be trained in the me, the technical and cultural achievements of the survivor elite. However, the use of Wi'ilu's blood carried an unforeseen consequence that would echo through human history. Because the sacrificial god had been a leader of rebellion, the humans fashioned from his essence inherited a trace of that same defiant and independent spirit. This carefully calibrated balance ensured that humans would serve their creators willingly, understanding their place in the cosmic hierarchy, yet it also introduced an element of unpredictability and occasional resistance to divine commands that would drive future conflicts. The final stage of the laboratory work at Eridu involved the establishment of a sustainable reproductive cycle, ensuring that the new species could provide a permanent labor force without requiring constant divine intervention. The early prototypes had been fashioned individually, but for the recovery of civilization to succeed, the Adamu needed the capacity for self-replication. Ninmah oversaw the implementation of biological gender and a gestation process that mirrored divine birth but operated at an accelerated mortal rate. The texts describe her overseeing the first successful births, using birthing bricks and specific incantations, which served as genetic activation sequences to ensure the health and viability of the offspring. With the establishment of a breeding population, the Anunnaki had officially solved their labor crisis, creating a biological servant class that would soon populate the fertile plains of Mesopotamia. The success of the Adamu project marked the official conclusion of the Age of Divine Labor and the beginning of the Golden Age of Cooperation. The laboratory at Eridu, once a chamber of failed experiments, transitioned into a training center where the first generations of humans were instructed in the fundamental skills required to maintain the cosmic order. They were taught to manage the waters of the Abzu, to cultivate the perfected grain varieties provided by the goddess of grain, and to build the massive ziggurats that would serve as the points of contact between the earthly and celestial realms. The gods had secured their workforce, and humans had been given a purpose rooted in divine service. However, the memory of the discarded prototypes and the rebellious blood of Wielu remained embedded deep within the human code, a biological ticking clock that would eventually lead to the great reset of the deluge. The successful creation and stabilization of the human species marked the beginning of what the Sumerian records describe as the Golden Age, an extraordinary epoch when divine human cooperation reached unprecedented heights and civilization flourished under direct celestial guidance. This was not a period characterized by the distant or abstract worship often associated with later religions, but rather a time of direct and tangible mentorship where the survivor elite functioned as the active architects of a new world. The Sumerian king list, one of the most remarkable documents surviving from ancient Mesopotamia, provides our clearest window into this epoch through its catalogue of antediluvian rulers whose reigns were recorded to have lasted for thousands of years. According to the cuneiform tablets discovered at Nippur and other major sites, these kings served as the essential intermediaries between the divine realm of the Anunnaki and the developing mortal society. Their extraordinary lifespans were not merely mythological exaggerations, but reflected the closer biological proximity between the creators and the human workforce during this primordial era. The list begins with Alulim of Eridu, whose reign of 28,800 years established the fundamental pattern for antediluvian rulership. Archaeological excavations at Eridu have revealed continuous occupations, stretching back to approximately 5,400 BC, making it one of the oldest known cities in Mesopotamia and the undisputed birthplace of organized civilization. The site stratigraphy shows 18 distinct building levels of temples dedicated to Enki, each constructed directly upon the ruins of its predecessor, which suggests an unbroken tradition of technical and religious practice spanning several millennia. These astronomical figures for royal reigns take on a different significance when examined within the context of Mesopotamian mathematical systems and their sophisticated astronomical knowledge. The numbers correspond to calculations based on the sacred number 3600, known as the Sa, which represented one complete cycle of divine time. Each royal reign was carefully aligned with specific astronomical periods, suggesting that these kings served not only as political leaders but as cosmic regulators whose terms of office were synchronized with the movements of the stars. The city of Eridu itself was the prototype for all subsequent urban development, and archaeological evidence supports the textual claims that its construction followed a precise geometric plan supervised by Enki. The earliest levels of the city contain pottery and architectural features that demonstrate a level of urban planning that was fully formed from the very foundation of the settlement. This contradicts the traditional model of gradual evolution and suggests that the knowledge required for city building was introduced as a complete system. The symbiotic relationship between the Anunnaki and humanity during this golden age operated through these temple complexes, which functioned as the focal points of urban life. These institutions were not just religious centers, but served as economic hubs, administrative headquarters, and technological workshops where divine knowledge was methodically transmitted to human specialists. The primary mechanism for the transfer of advanced knowledge to humanity during the Golden Age was the concept of the me, which can be understood as divine powers or cultural blueprints that could be bestowed upon mortals by royal decree. The Epic of Inanna and Enki describes how the goddess of love and war obtained over 100 mi from the god of wisdom and transported them to a city of Uruk, where they became the absolute foundation of human civilization. These divine gifts were not abstract or magical in nature, but represented practical knowledge and technical skills, including the arts of kingship, the protocols of the priesthood, the techniques of metalwork, and the complicated systems of legal procedure. The Mi enabled humans to create complex societies by providing the specialized information required to manage every aspect of urban life. Enki's role as the patron of humanity emerges clearly from these sources, as he established schools within his temples, where human apprentices learned the arts of healing, mathematics, and astronomy under direct instruction. The agricultural revolution that enabled permanent urban settlement received direct intervention, according to the Sumerian records. Ninurta, the god of farming and irrigation, personally taught humans the techniques of canal construction, crop rotation, and seasonal planting that transformed the Mesopotamian landscape from a harsh desert into productive farmland. Archaeological surveys of ancient irrigation systems in southern Iraq have revealed an engineering sophistication that supports these textual claims. The canal networks show evidence of precise gradient calculations and sophisticated lock systems for controlling water flow that required coordinated labor across multiple settlements. Barley and emmer wheat, the foundation crops of the Mesopotamian economy, appear in the archaeological record with remarkable suddenness around 3500 BC. This suggests a rapid adoption of perfected agricultural techniques rather than a gradual development through trial and error. Paleobotanical analysis reveals that these early crops possessed genetic characteristics that would have required selective breeding over many hundreds of generations to achieve, yet they appear fully developed in the earliest agricultural contexts. Sumerian texts credit the goddess of grain, Ninlil, with providing these perfected varieties directly to human farmers, which explains the archaeological puzzle of their sudden and high-quality appearance. The transfer of knowledge extended to the arts of the smithy and weapon making, taught by the god Ninurta at the city of Bad Tibera. Excavations at the site have uncovered evidence of advanced metallurgical activity dating to the 4th millennium BC, including sophisticated copper smelting facilities and workshops for producing bronze tools. The archaeological evidence supports the tradition of a technical knowledge that was remarkably advanced for its historical period, indicating that the human workforce was being rapidly upskilled to meet the demands of the Anunnaki reconstruction project. The integration of sacred and practical functions reached its architectural peak in the city of Uruk, which grew to become the largest city in the world by the year 3000 BC. The city's massive walls, described as the work of the hero king Gilgamesh under divine guidance, enclosed an area of approximately 6 square kilometers and required sophisticated engineering to construct. Archaeological investigation has confirmed that these fortifications incorporated advanced defensive features, including towers positioned for overlapping fields of fire and water channels that could flood the approaches during siege conditions. At the heart of the city stood the Anu ziggurat, dedicated to the supreme god of heaven, which demonstrates the architectural sophistication achieved through this divine human collaboration. Standing nearly 40 meters high, this artificial mountain required precise mathematical calculations to ensure structural stability while elevating the divine dwelling above the earthly realm. The construction techniques employed for these monumental structures involved massive mud brick cores reinforced with woven reed mats, a technology that distributed weight evenly and provided essential flexibility during seismic activity. Cuneiform building inscriptions explicitly credit divine architects with providing the technical specifications that made such monumental construction possible. Beyond the physical structures, the invention of writing itself represents the most significant transfer of knowledge during the Golden Age. Sumerian texts consistently attribute the development of cuneiform script to divine revelation, specifically to the goddess Nisaba, who served as the patron of the scribal arts. The earliest written documents from Uruk, dating to approximately 3200 BC, appear fully formed as a complex system capable of recording both economic transactions and sophisticated religious concepts. This sudden emergence of writing contradicts all standard evolutionary models of script development and supports the claims of direct instruction in literacy. Archaeological analysis of early cuneiform tablets reveals technical features that demonstrate an advanced understanding of information, storage, and retrieval systems. The tablets were manufactured according to standardized sizes and shapes that facilitated filing and cross-referencing, while the script itself employed systematic principles of phonetic representation that enabled the precise recording of spoken language. These characteristics suggest that writing did not emerge through gradual experimentation by primitive accountants, but through systematic instruction by teachers who possessed a comprehensive understanding of linguistic principles and information management. This allowed the administrative needs of the growing city-states to be met with unprecedented efficiency, ensuring that the labor of humanity remained organized and productive. The scientific achievements of the Golden Age reached their highest expression in the fields of astronomy and mathematics, reflecting divine instruction in celestial observation and calculation. The sexagesimal number system, based on the number 60, enabled precise calculations of planetary movements, eclipse cycles, and seasonal variations that formed the absolute foundation of the Mesopotamian calendar systems. Observatory platforms built at the top of ziggurats provided the elevated positions necessary for systematic skywatching, while temple archives maintained detailed records of celestial events spanning many centuries of observation. This astronomical knowledge was not merely for timekeeping, but was essential for the synchronization of human activity with the cosmic order established by the Anunnaki. Human artisans working under divine patronage achieved levels of technical sophistication in the production of luxury goods and tools that would not be surpassed for thousands of years. The Royal Cemetery at Ur contains artifacts demonstrating a total mastery of goldsmithing, lapidary work, and textile production that required specialized knowledge of metallurgy, geology, and chemistry. Queen Puabi's headdress, crafted from gold leaves and lapis lazuli beads, displays a technical virtuosity that indicates a deep understanding of material properties and divine iconography. This symbiotic relationship between the creators and the created produced an era of unprecedented prosperity and cultural achievement, but it also established deep patterns of dependence. Humans had become indispensable to the welfare of the survivor elite through their labor and offerings, while the gods had become essential to human survival through their continued blessing of crops, protection from natural disasters, and maintenance of cosmic order. This mutual dependence created a stable but ultimately fragile system that would face its first severe testing as the human population began to grow beyond the gods' original calculations. As the cities expanded and the plains of Mesopotamia filled with the sounds of human activity, the peaceful cooperation of the Golden Age began to fracture. The very success of the Anunnaki's engineering project led to the demographic explosion that would eventually trigger the noise crisis and the divine frustration of Enlil. The gods had taught humans how to thrive, but they had not anticipated how quickly the human species would multiply once provided with the tools of advanced civilization. The administrative texts from the end of this period begin to record the first complaints about the crowding of temple precincts and the disturbance of divine repose. The symbiotic bond was under strain, and the direct guidance of the masters was about to be challenged by the sheer vitality and volume of their own creation. The Golden Age was drawing to a close, and the shadow of the Great Judgment began to fall across the cities of the plain. The extraordinary prosperity and technological stability of the Golden Age contained within it the biological seeds of its own eventual destruction as the human populations began to multiply exponentially beyond the original strategic calculations of the Anunnaki architects. The Atrahasis epic, which is preserved in its most complete form on 3 cuneiform tablets from the ancient library of Ashurbanipal, provides a meticulously detailed account of how divine benevolence gradually transformed into cosmic frustration and ultimately into a murderous intent. The first tablet of this epic establishes a clear timeline of human expansion, describing in vivid detail how the initial and highly controlled settlements of Eridu and Uruk successfully spawned numerous daughter cities across the vast and fertile plains of Mesopotamia. Modern archaeological surveys conducted by the Oriental Institute of Chicago have confirmed this specific pattern of urban proliferation, identifying over 200 distinct settlement sites dating to the 4th millennium BC scattered across what is now the region of southern Iraq. This unprecedented demographic explosion followed humanity's successful and rapid adaptation to the agricultural life and technical protocols provided by their creators, yet it created administrative challenges that the Divine Council was not prepared to manage. Cuneiform administrative texts recovered from the city of Nippur document the exponential increase in the volume of temple offerings required to sustain these rapidly growing populations, while simultaneously recording the first formal complaints from high-ranking priestly officials about the chaos generated by these expanding urban centers. The ancient tablets describe how the constant and unrelenting den of human activity, including massive construction projects, bustling market transactions, loud religious festivals, and endless domestic disputes, began to penetrate even the most sacred and secluded precincts where the gods sought their rest and contemplation. Enlil's growing and visible irritation with this human noise emerges as a central and recurring theme in multiple Mesopotamian texts, reflecting much deeper theological concerns about the proper and sustainable relationship between the divine and mortal realms. The god of earth and storm, who was long accustomed to the ordered and majestic silence of the cosmic spaces, found himself increasingly and violently disturbed by the cacophony of the very civilization he had helped to establish. Temple records from Nippur go so far as to describe how Enlil's own priests reported their deity's specific complaints regarding severe sleep deprivation caused by the round-the-clock human activity that now surrounded his sacred home. The concept of noise described in the Mesopotamian records was not merely an acoustic or auditory disturbance, but represented a fundamental state of cosmic disorder that threatened the absolute authority of the Anunnaki Council. The god's temple, which was traditionally a place of total divine repose and silent administrative focus, had become physically surrounded by an expanding sprawl of workshops, busy markets, and dense residential quarters that generated continuous noise pollution and social friction. The second tablet of the Atrahasis epic provides a chilling and detailed account of the escalating divine response to this human overpopulation through a series of increasingly severe and calculated interventions designed to reduce mortal numbers without immediately destroying the entire species. Enlil's first major attempt at population control involved the deliberate withdrawal of divine blessings from the essential agricultural activities of the region, causing widespread and devastating crop failures. Archaeological evidence suggests that such events occurred around the year 3200 BC, as pollen analysis from ancient lake beds in the Mesopotamian region shows a dramatic and sudden decline in cereal cultivation. These scientific findings are followed by evidence of severe famine conditions, including the discovery of mass burial sites and numerous abandoned settlements across the plain. When this initial famine failed to achieve a sufficient and permanent reduction in the human population, Enlil chose to escalate his tactics to more direct and biological interventions. The ancient texts describe how the gods sent forth plague demons to spread lethal diseases among the crowded human populations, specifically targeting the dense urban centers where the noise levels had reached their peak. Mesopotamian medical texts from this period reveal a sophisticated understanding of these epidemic diseases, providing detailed descriptions of symptoms that correspond precisely to the bubonic plague, typhoid fever, and dysentery. The sheer prevalence of these medical treatises in the archaeological record suggests that such disease outbreaks were frequent enough and severe enough to require a systematic and organized medical response from the human survivors. Excavations at cemetery sites dating to the late 4th millennium BC provide further support for these textual accounts of massive mortality events, with researchers uncovering mass burial pits containing hundreds of skeletons that show clear signs of malnutrition and acute disease. The resilience of the human species in the face of these divine punishments became a primary source of frustration for the Enlil faction within the Anunnaki Council. Despite the recurring famines and the devastating plagues, human populations demonstrated a remarkable and almost supernatural capacity for rapid recovery and reconstruction. The Atrahasis epic describes how the survivors of each successive catastrophe quickly rebuilt their broken communities and resumed their reproduction at rates that soon restored their previous population levels, effectively nullifying the gods' efforts at control. This pattern of rapid demographic recovery not only frustrated the divine attempts at population management, but also inadvertently demonstrated the absolute success of Enki's original and robust design specifications for human durability. This success, however, only served to increase the tension within the divine assembly as Enki's protective interventions on humanity's behalf became more obvious and frequent. Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, had developed a genuine and deep affection for his human creations, viewing them not merely as expendable labor units, but as capable students who could learn and grow. Cuneiform tablets recovered from the city of Eridu describe how Enki would secretly provide human communities with advanced warnings of impending divine punishments, enabling them to take specific protective measures that significantly minimize their casualties. The theological and political implications of this divine conflict extended far beyond a simple disagreement over population policy or urban planning. Enlil's position reflected a traditional and harsh divine supremacism that viewed humans as expendable tools whose only value was their utility to the gods' purposes. His approach to the noise problem focused entirely on eliminating the source of the disturbance rather than adapting the divine practices to accommodate the presence of a growing civilization. This perspective was perfectly aligned with his role as the absolute enforcer of cosmic order, where any deviation from the established patterns required immediate and forceful correction. As the conflict between Enki and Enlil intensified, the original covenant that had governed the divine-human relationship began to break down completely. The initial agreement had established very clear boundaries and mutual obligations. Humans would provide the necessary labor and worship in exchange for divine protection and technical guidance. However, the exponential and uncontrolled growth of the human populations had fundamentally altered the terms of this relationship without any formal renegotiation between the parties. While humans continued to fulfill their labor obligations through temple service, their sheer numbers created environmental and social problems that the original covenant had never anticipated. Mesopotamian legal texts from the temple archives revealed desperate human attempts to address these issues through the formal regulation of activities, including priestly edicts that established quiet hours around temple complexes and restricted construction near the sacred precincts. These regulations proved that the human administrators recognized the problem, required systematic solutions, yet they also indicate the total inadequacy of such measures when applied to a rapidly expanding urban population. Within the framework of Mesopotamian theology, human overpopulation was eventually classified as a violation of the cosmic order because it disrupted the careful and necessary balance between the divine and mortal realms. Enlil's interpretation of cosmic law emphasized a total restoration of the original conditions through any means necessary, viewing human expansion as a form of cosmic cancer that required aggressive treatment to prevent a total systemic collapse of the universe. His increasingly extreme measures reflected a genuine concern for universal stability, even if his methods appeared murderous to the humans facing his wrath. The themes of moral corruption that emerge in later literature had their origins in this fundamental breakdown of the cosmic order, as the violation of boundaries led to widespread social chaos and internal conflict within the human cities. Archaeological evidence from the late 4th millennium BC reveals increasing social stratification and evidence of violent conflict, including fortified elite compounds and mass graves containing victims of violence, all of which point to a civilization on the brink of collapse, even before the flood waters began to rise. The divine deadlock that had paralyzed the celestial assembly for generations finally reached its absolute breaking point when Enlil presented his ultimate and terrifying solution to the Anunnaki Council. The god of earth and storm, his patience completely exhausted by many millennia of unrelenting human noise and an exponential population growth that defied every original parameter, proposed nothing less than the complete and total submersion of the entire earth beneath the primordial waters. This was intended as the ultimate reset protocol, a catastrophic event that would restore the cosmic silence that had existed before human creation, while simultaneously eliminating the labor management crisis by removing the need for physical labor altogether. The Nippur Temple archives contain fragmentary and chilling records of this momentous assembly, where Enlil's proposal was met with stunned silence from his divine colleagues who had not fully anticipated such an extreme and final solution to their administrative difficulties. The theological and legal implications of a universal flood required an exhaustive consideration of cosmic law and divine precedent within the Mesopotamian legal tradition, which demanded that even the gods justify their actions according to established principles of justice and cosmic order. Enlil's case for universal destruction rested on the formal argument that humanity had violated the fundamental terms of their creation by exceeding the population parameters originally envisioned by their makers. The noise pollution that prevented divine rest was presented as a significant breach of the original labor for protection contract, a violation sufficient to void all protective obligations held by the gods toward their creation. Furthermore, Marduk's technical analysis of long-term sustainability provided the decisive factor in swaying the divine opinion. He calculated that current population growth rates would eventually require exponentially increasing divine resources to maintain adequate oversight and blessing of human activities. Within several more generations, the gods would find themselves working harder to manage human affairs than humans themselves labored to serve divine needs, completely inverting the original purpose of human creation. Geological surveys conducted by the University of Pennsylvania have identified a distinctive flood stratum at numerous sites including Uruk, Kish, and Shurapak, indicating synchronized inundation events that extended far beyond normal seasonal flooding patterns and providing physical evidence for these ancient accounts. Enlil's victory within the divine assembly came with important procedural requirements that reflected the extreme gravity of universal destruction. Mesopotamian cosmic law required the absolute and unanimous consent from the 7 gods who determined destiny before implementing measures that would fundamentally alter the structure of creation. This legal framework forced extended and difficult negotiations as holdout deities demanded specific concessions and guarantees before agreeing to support the flood proposal. The oath-taking ceremony that formally authorized the Great Deluge created binding and inescapable obligations that would profoundly influence the subsequent events. Each member of the divine assembly was forced to swear by their most sacred symbols to maintain absolute and total secrecy about the planned destruction, ensuring that humanity would receive no advanced warning that might enable survival preparations. The cuneiform text from Nippur preserves the actual wording of these divine oaths, invoking terrifying penalties of cosmic dissolution and eternal exile for any god who violated the secrecy agreement. Enki's participation in this oath-taking ceremony represented the most agonizing decision of his entire divine existence. The god of wisdom and fresh water understood that refusing to swear would likely result in his immediate exclusion from the divine assembly and the loss of his authority over the Abzu, effectively ending his ability to protect humanity through any official channels. However, agreeing to the oath would bind him to remain silent while his beloved human creations faced total extinction without any warning or opportunity for escape. The technical specifications for the Great Deluge required extensive planning and coordination among multiple divine departments. Enlil, as the god of earth and storm, would provide the atmospheric disturbances necessary to generate unprecedented rainfall across the entire inhabited world. Nergal, the deity of the subterranean realm, would contribute by opening the springs of the Abzu and directing subterranean rivers toward the surface, while Ninurta ensured that no mountain peaks remained dry. This coordinated assault from both atmospheric and terrestrial water sources created inundation patterns that archaeological evidence confirms extended far beyond the normal floodplains of the major rivers. Enki's decision to circumvent the divine secrecy oath through indirect communication represents one of the most ingenious and famous examples of theological loophole exploitation in ancient literature. The god understood that he could not directly warn the flood hero about the impending destruction without violating his sworn obligations to the divine assembly. However, the specific wording of the oath prohibited only direct communication of the flood plans to human beings, leaving open the possibility of indirect methods that would preserve the technical and legal integrity of his divine commitments. The famous reed wall scene, preserved in multiple versions across different flood narratives, demonstrates Enki's solution to this impossible dilemma. The god positioned himself beside the reed wall of Ziusudra's house and spoke aloud about the planned flood, as if addressing the wall itself rather than the human king who stood behind it. This clever theatrical performance allowed Enki to convey essential survival information while maintaining plausible deniability regarding any direct communication with mortals. The specific instructions that Enki provided through this indirect method revealed a sophisticated and advanced understanding of naval architecture and flood survival techniques. The god specified the precise dimensions for the massive ark that Ziusudra must construct: 120 cubits in length, breadth, and height, creating a massive cube-shaped vessel designed for maximum stability in turbulent waters rather than speed or maneuverability. The use of cubic proportions reflected sacred mathematical principles that would ensure divine protection for the vessel and its critical contents. Construction materials for the ark required careful selection to ensure both structural integrity and ritual purity, with Enki specifying that the hull must be built from reeds and palm fibers and waterproofed with thick bitumen. The internal compartmentalization of the ark followed precise specifications that reflected both practical storage requirements and cosmic symbolism. Enki instructed Ziusudra to create 7 decks within the vessel, each divided into 9 compartments, producing 63 separate spaces that corresponded to important numbers within Mesopotamian mathematical and astronomical systems. The loading procedures for the ark required careful and systematic attention to both biological and theological considerations. Ziusudra was instructed to select breeding pairs of all domestic animals essential for agricultural reconstruction, while also preserving wild species that played important roles in Mesopotamian religious symbolism. The inclusion of skilled craftsmen and their families ensured that essential technical knowledge would survive the deluge, while priests and their ritual paraphernalia would maintain the religious traditions necessary for proper divine worship in the post-flood world. The 7-day construction period specified by Enki created enormous logistical challenges that would normally require several months of work by experienced shipbuilders, suggesting that Ziusudra received direct divine aid or the temporary acceleration of time to complete the vessel. As the final preparations were completed, Ziusudra brought his family, the craftsmen, and the biological seed of the earth into the massive cube, sealing the hatch with a final, thick layer of bitumen. The onset of the Great Deluge began with atmospheric and terrestrial disturbances that exceeded anything previously recorded in human experience. The Atrahasis epic describes how Enlil gathered storm clouds from across the known world, concentrating them above Mesopotamia until they blocked out the sun and created a state of perpetual darkness. The god's mastery of weather systems enabled him to generate rainfall intensities that overwhelmed all existing drainage systems, while simultaneously preventing water from flowing toward the sea. Nergal's contribution involved directing subterranean rivers toward the surface through springs and wells, creating a coordinated assault from both above and below. This dual approach ensured that no elevated areas remained dry long enough for human populations to construct emergency shelters or organize any systematic survival efforts. This coordinated assault eliminated any possibility that humans might interpret the flood as a natural disaster rather than a deliberate and final divine punishment, marking the end of an entire age and the silencing of the noise that had so deeply troubled the architects of the earth. The active execution of the Great Deluge represented the most complex and devastating application of planetary engineering ever recorded in ancient history. It was designed not merely as a flood, but as a total environmental reset that would eradicate all traces of the human infrastructure that had caused so much divine irritation. According to the Atrahasis epic, the catastrophe began when Enlil gathered the storm clouds from every quadrant of the known world, concentrating them with such density that they created a state of perpetual darkness, effectively blotting out the sun. This atmospheric manipulation ensured that the rainfall would not be localized or seasonal, but a global downpour that exceeded any natural meteorological limits. While Enlil controlled the heavens, the god Nergal was tasked with the simultaneous release of the fountains of the deep. This involved the forced breaching of the Abzu's high-pressure underground aquifers, directing massive volumes of subterranean water toward the surface through artesian wells and geological fault lines. The dual assault from both the sky and the ground created a level of inundation that modern geological surveys have confirmed as a synchronized and catastrophic event. In cities like Shuruppak and Kish, the flood deposits show a clean break between occupation layers, containing a mixture of terrestrial silt and deep earth minerals that suggest a violent churning of the entire region's topography. This coordinated planetary strike by the Anunnaki ensured that no human community could organize a defense or find higher ground. The flooding was so intense that it did not just submerge buildings, it liquefied the very mud brick foundations of the city-states, reducing the achievements of the Golden Age to formless mounds in a matter of days. This was the physical manifestation of the divine assembly's collective judgment, a process of total structural and biological purification that utilized the fundamental elements of water and wind to silence the noise of a runaway civilization. The duration of the active flooding phase, recorded as 40 days and 40 nights, was a calculated period designed to align with sacred mathematical and ritual cycles. Within the framework of Mesopotamian temple protocols, 40 days represented the time required for the absolute purification of a polluted space. In this context, the entire Earth was treated as a temple precinct that had been desecrated by human overpopulation and noise, necessitating a complete cleansing before the gods would consider returning. During this period, the atmospheric conditions were so severe that even the Anunnaki themselves reportedly retreated to the highest celestial realms, cowering as they watched the absolute dissolution of their terrestrial management project. The hydraulic forces involved were unprecedented, with waves reaching heights that exceeded the tallest ziggurats and winds powerful enough to reshape the coastal geography of the Persian Gulf. Inside the cubic arc of Zeusudra, the survival of the human seed and the preserved technical blueprints depended entirely on the engineering specifications provided by Enki. While a cubic vessel is impractical for traditional navigation, it possessed extraordinary survivability in a chaotic sea state where the water was churning in multiple directions simultaneously. The internal honeycombed structure, consisting of 7 decks and 63 separate compartments, prevented the cargo and livestock from shifting, which would have surely capsized any traditional boat. Modern naval simulations have confirmed that this cubic geometry offers maximum stability in turbulent conditions, acting as a floating fortress rather than a ship. The Ark was effectively a biological time capsule, a 63-compartment laboratory designed to wait out the extinction protocol until the waters receded enough to allow for a reboot of the global ecosystem. The recession of the floodwaters, after 150 days, revealed a landscape that had been stripped of its former abundance and was entirely alien to the survivors. The fertile topsoil of the Mesopotamian plains had been washed away, and the complex irrigation networks that had taken centuries to build were filled with millions of tons of debris. This period of recession was managed by Enki, who adjusted the terrestrial elevation and reopened the natural drainage basins to allow the earth to dry. Archaeological excavations at Shurapak show a distinctive layer of sterile clay, nearly 5 meters thick in some areas, which sits directly on top of the pre-flood ruins, marking the absolute end of the antediluvian era. For the small group of survivors inside the Ark, the exit into this new world was not a moment of celebration, but the beginning of an agonizing process of reconstruction under much harsher environmental conditions. The gods, who had been starving for the nourishment of human offerings during the months of the deluge, gathered around the first post-flood sacrifice performed by Ziusudra. The aroma of the burning incense signaled a reluctant truce between Enlil and the human remnant, but the relationship had been fundamentally and permanently altered. The Anunnaki realized that while they had achieved the cosmic silence they desired, they had nearly destroyed their own logistical support system. From this point forward, the direct guidance of the Golden Age would be replaced by a more distant form of management. The gods would no longer walk among men as they had in the pre-flood cities. Instead, they established a professional priesthood to act as intermediaries, ensuring that humanity would serve them from a respectful and controlled distance. The Great Reset had achieved its goal of population control, but it also initiated a period of technological and biological decline for the human species. The most profound and lasting consequence of the Great Deluge was the deliberate biological weakening of the human species, a process documented by the dramatic contraction of lifespans in the Sumerian king list. Before the flood, rulers like Enmanluana reigned for tens of thousands of years. After the flood, the durations of kingship dropped into the hundreds and eventually the dozens of years. This was not a natural evolutionary shift, but a systematic divine reprogramming of the human genetic code designed to prevent the rapid accumulation of population and power that had led to the original crisis. Each successive generation lost a percentage of its biological vitality, a geometric progression that ensured humanity would remain mortal, fragile, and eternally dependent on the gods for survival. Anthropological analysis of skeletal remains from the early dynastic period confirms this trend, showing a significant decrease in average height and bone density compared to pre-flood specimens. The physical world itself had become more toxic and less productive, requiring more intensive human labor to achieve the same agricultural results that were once granted by divine blessing. The technical blueprints of civilization were reissued to the survivors, but the full scope of antediluvian knowledge was never fully restored. Humanity was now a diminished species, tasked with rebuilding from the mud, but without the direct, hands-on mentorship of their creators. This era of reconstruction saw the emergence of divine kingship as a compromise, where human leaders served as the delegates of absent gods, holding the authority to organize labor while lacking the millennial lifespans of their predecessors. The Great Reset had successfully silenced the noise and restored the cosmic order of Enlil, but it left humanity with the heavy burden of mortality and a deep ancestral memory of a lost world that would haunt the collective consciousness for thousands of years. The emergence of Ziusudra from the massive cubic ark onto the devastated and mud-caked landscape of post-flood Mesopotamia marked the beginning of humanity's most profound and agonizing transformation since their original creation in the workshop of Enki. The waters that had covered the entire earth for 150 days gradually receded, revealing a world that was not only stripped of its former agricultural abundance, but was forever altered in its fundamental physical and biological relationship with the divine realm. The Sumerian king list provides our most striking and irrefutable evidence of this transformation through its dramatic documentation of how human lifespans contracted from the millennial-long reigns of antediluvian rulers to the mere centuries that characterized post-flood kingship. While the first king, after the deluge, Etana of Kish, reigned for 1,560 years, his successors show an even further and more rapid reduction, with most early dynastic kings ruling for periods measured in decades rather than centuries. This progressive diminishment reflects the gradual weakening of the divine essence within human consciousness as the distance from the original creation event increased. Archaeological excavations conducted at major sites across Mesopotamia reveal a stark and undeniable discontinuity between pre-flood and post-flood material culture, showing that the technological sophistication of the earlier era was suddenly and systematically lost to human knowledge. At the royal cemetery of Ur, the magnificent grave goods discovered in the early dynastic period actually pale in comparison to artifacts found in deeper pre-flood strata that demonstrate a level of technological mastery subsequently lost to the human race. Gold work from these antediluvian levels shows an absolute mastery of granulation techniques and complex alloy compositions that would not reappear in the historical record until the Neo-Assyrian period, nearly 2 millennia later. Similarly, cylinder seals from the deepest archaeological contexts display an artistic refinement and symbolic complexity that suggest direct divine instruction in their design and execution. While post-flood examples show a gradual decline in both technical skill and theological sophistication. This loss of technical capability forced the surviving human populations to rebuild their civilization from a significantly lower baseline, struggling to replicate the achievements of their ancestors. The biological changes that affected post-Diluvian humanity extended far beyond simple lifespan reduction and entered the realm of systemic physiological deterioration. Cuneiform medical texts from the Old Babylonian period describe human physiology as fundamentally weakened and corrupted compared to the original antediluvian standards established by the Anunnaki. These ancient records document an increased susceptibility to chronic disease, a marked reduction in physical strength, and a significant diminishment in sensory acuity, particularly in sight and hearing. The Epic of Gilgamesh preserves the fading traditions of heroes from the immediate post-flood period who still possessed superhuman abilities, but these traits gradually disappeared from the human gene pool as successive generations moved further from the divine spark. Skeletal remains from cemetery sites dating to the early dynastic period support these textual claims about post-Diluvian physical deterioration with tragic clarity. Anthropological analysis reveals that the average human height decreased by approximately 15 centimeters compared to pre-flood populations, indicating a sudden shift in growth hormones or environmental stresses. Furthermore, bone density measurements indicate a trend toward reduced physical power and increased skeletal fragility among the common population. Dental examinations show evidence of widespread nutritional deficiencies and dental decay that had been remarkably absent in earlier populations, suggesting that post-flood humans struggled to maintain the high dietary standards that had sustained their antediluvian ancestors. The mathematical precision evident in these chronological and biological reductions suggests systematic divine intervention rather than natural evolutionary processes. Each successive generation lost approximately 1/3 of the previous generation's lifespan, following a geometric progression that corresponds precisely to the sacred numbers within Mesopotamian mathematical systems. This pattern indicates a deliberate divine reprogramming of human mortality rates designed by Enlil to prevent the rapid population explosion and the resulting noise that had triggered the original flood. In this new and weakened era, the nature of worship and divine human interaction underwent a fundamental and permanent shift. Mesopotamian temple archives document the establishment of entirely new religious protocols designed to manage divine relationships at a much greater distance than had characterized the golden age of direct guidance. The elaborate daily feeding rituals that had previously sustained a direct divine presence in the temple complexes were replaced by symbolic offerings that acknowledged divine authority while recognizing the god's withdrawal from immediate earthly involvement. Priestly manuals from Nippur describe how temple personnel were forced to adapt their ceremonial practices to address absent or hidden deities rather than physically present divine beings. The construction of increasingly elaborate and massive temple complexes during the early dynastic period reflected humanity's desperate attempt to attract divine attention back to earthly affairs through sheer architectural scale. The White Temple at Uruk was rebuilt and expanded multiple times during this period, with each reconstruction adding height and decorative complexity designed to make the structure visible from the celestial realm, serving as a desperate beacon for the withdrawn gods. Archaeological evidence shows that these building campaigns required enormous expenditures of human labor and resources, suggesting that post-flood communities prioritized divine appeasement over their own immediate material needs. Because humans had lost direct access to divine counsel, the development of professional priesthoods as intermediaries became an absolute necessity. These hereditary priestly lineages underwent extensive training in ritual procedures, theological interpretation, and the administrative management of temple properties. These specialists assumed the crushing responsibility for maintaining divine relationships that ordinary humans could no longer sustain through direct contact. The development of divination practices during this period reflects this loss of direct access, as liver divination, astronomical observation, and dream interpretation became the primary tools for royal decision-making. The gradual withdrawal of the gods from direct earthly involvement created massive power vacuums that human institutions struggled to fill with limited success. Royal inscriptions from the early dynastic period show an increasing and almost frantic emphasis on divine legitimation of human authority as kings sought to compensate for their reduced direct access to celestial guidance. The institution of divine kingship emerged as a compromise solution, acknowledging human limitations while maintaining claims to supernatural authority through ceremonial identification with patron deities. Furthermore, the absence of direct divine judgment required the development of elaborate human judicial systems to resolve disputes that had previously been settled through divine ordeal or direct divine pronouncement. The laws of Ur-Nammu, dating to approximately 2100 BC, established precedent-based legal reasoning that was specifically designed to compensate for the unavailability of case-by-case divine guidance. The economic implications of this divine withdrawal were equally profound and devastating. Administrative texts from Gyeosu document how the reduced divine presence in temple complexes led to decreased agricultural productivity from temple lands that had previously benefited from direct divine blessing and technical oversight. Irrigation systems required more intensive and constant human maintenance as divine oversight of water management diminished, while craft production faced severe quality control challenges without direct divine instruction in technical procedures. Trade relationships became more difficult and dangerous as divine protection for merchant caravans decreased, leading to the development of professional military escorts and increasingly elaborate commercial contracts to address risks that had been minimal during the antediluvian period. Perhaps most tragically, human consciousness itself was transformed. Philosophical texts describe how post-diluvian humans experienced increasing difficulty accessing the spiritual insights and technical intuition that had been readily available to their ancestors. The divine spark within human consciousness, derived from the sacrificed god, Wi-Ilu, gradually dimmed as successive generations moved further from the original creation event, leaving humanity to navigate a silent world with only the fading echoes of their creator's wisdom. The narrative threads woven through the ancient Sumerian tablets have proven to be remarkably persistent, spreading across diverse cultures and millennia in ways that suggest either an extremely ancient common historical memory or shared archetypal experiences that transcend all known geographical boundaries. The flood account preserved in the Epic of Gilgamesh bears striking and undeniable similarities to the Hebrew narrative of Noah found in the Book of Genesis, indicating a shared heritage of the Great Reset. Yet, the subtle differences in these accounts reveal how each subsequent culture adapted the core story to reflect their own particular theological concerns and social structures. While the Sumerian hero Ziusudra receives a divine warning through Enki's clever and indirect circumvention of a divine oath of secrecy, the selection of Noah in the Hebrew tradition appears based solely on his righteousness in a corrupted world. The Hebrew account shifts the focus toward moral judgment and a covenant relationship, effectively transforming the original Mesopotamian theme of divine irritation with human noise into a much broader condemnation of human wickedness and ethical failure. Comparative archaeological investigation of flood narratives across dozens of ancient cultures reveals a remarkable consistency in these basic structural elements that extends far beyond the Hebrew and Mesopotamian traditions. The Greek account of Deucalion and Pyrrha, preserved in the writings of Apollodorus and other classical sources, describes a universal deluge sent by the god Zeus to punish human impiety and arrogance. In this version, the survival of a single righteous couple leads to the repopulation of the earth through a unique method of throwing stones that transform into humans, a detail that finds no direct parallel in the Mesopotamian sources. Despite these localized cultural variations, the core elements of a deliberate divine judgment, a universal destruction of the existing order, and a selective survival of a chosen few remain perfectly consistent across the Mediterranean world. This global consistency points toward a singular catastrophic event that was witnessed by the survivors of the pre-flood civilization and meticulously recorded in their foundational myths as a warning for all future generations. The Hindu flood narratives, particularly the ancient account of Manu preserved in the Matsya Purana, demonstrate even more striking and technical parallels to the original Sumerian sources despite the vast geographical and temporal distances involved. According to these texts, Manu receives a direct warning of an impending and total deluge from the god Vishnu in his fish avatar form. Following divine instructions, Manu builds a massive boat according to precise specifications and successfully preserves the seeds of all life forms through the global catastrophe. The technical details regarding the boat construction, the specific duration of the flooding, and the gradual emergence of dry land correspond with extraordinary precision to the Mesopotamian accounts. While the theological framework reflects distinctly Hindu concepts of cosmic cycles and divine avatars, the underlying physical and logistical details suggest a shared technical manual for survival that was distributed across the ancient world. Similarly, Native American flood traditions documented across dozens of tribal cultures from the Pacific Northwest to the Great Plains preserve remarkably similar narrative structures despite their absolute geographic isolation from Old World civilizations. The Ojibwe account of Nanabozo and the Great Flood, the Hopi tradition of world destruction and renewal, and the Lakota story of the cosmic waters all feature powerful divine beings who warn selected humans of an impending planetary catastrophe. These accounts consistently detail the construction of survival vessels or high-altitude refuges and the subsequent renewal of creation with significantly diminished human populations. These independent developments of the flood narrative across the Americas suggest either extremely ancient common origins that predated the migration across the Bering Land Bridge or a universal human response to catastrophic environmental events that affected the entire planet simultaneously. The persistence of these themes across such diverse and isolated populations indicates that the memory of the reset is embedded in the collective human consciousness as a fundamental historical truth. The recurring motif of divine regret over human creation appears across multiple cultural traditions, with variations that illuminate different theological perspectives on the relationship between creators and their creations. The Hebrew narrative explicitly states that God regretted making humans and was deeply grieved by their wickedness, leading directly to the flood as a necessary divine correction. Greek sources describe Zeus's growing frustration with human behavior through successive ages, culminating in periodic cycles of total destruction and renewal. Hindu cosmology incorporates very similar patterns through the concept of cosmic ages or yugas, where divine tolerance for human corruption reaches its limits and triggers universal destruction and recreation. These narratives suggest that the fundamental tension between human utility and human dignity that drove the Anunnaki politics is a universal theme in the human story, reflecting an ongoing struggle to understand the purpose and the limitations of our own existence. Archaeological discoveries throughout the 20th and 21st centuries have provided increasingly sophisticated tools for evaluating the historical foundations underlying these ancient narratives. Geological surveys across Mesopotamia have identified multiple flood strata dating to different periods, suggesting that catastrophic flooding was a recurring rather than a singular phenomenon in the region's history. The most significant flood deposits dating to approximately 2900 BC correspond closely to the chronological framework suggested by the Sumerian king lists, lending significant credibility to the claims that major historical events inspired the literary traditions. Satellite archaeology and ground-penetrating radar surveys have revealed extensive evidence of ancient settlement patterns that support the textual accounts of widespread urban development followed by sudden and violent abandonment. Sites across southern Mesopotamia show clear breaks in occupation during the late 4th and early 3rd millennia BC, with subsequent reoccupation showing markedly different cultural characteristics. These archaeological patterns align perfectly with the textual descriptions of an advanced antediluvian civilization destroyed by divine judgment and replaced by the diminished societies of the post-flood era. Modern scientific research in the fields of genetics and paleoclimatology has uncovered further evidence of the population bottlenecks and environmental disruptions described in the ancient flood narratives. Mitochondrial DNA analysis indicates that significant population reductions occurred during the Neolithic period, followed by a rapid and aggressive expansion and diversification of human populations. While these genetic patterns could result from various factors, they demonstrate that the ancient accounts of near extinction, followed by rapid recovery, reflect entirely plausible demographic scenarios for the human species. Furthermore, ice core data from Greenland and Antarctica reveals evidence of major climatic disruptions around 3000 BC, including massive temperature fluctuations and precipitation patterns that could have triggered the exceptional flooding described in the River Valley civilizations. These scientific findings demonstrate that the historical context of these ancient myths included environmental conditions capable of producing the catastrophic events that would have profoundly impacted all human populations. The enduring questions raised by Sumerian literature about humanity's purpose, divine justice, and the relationship between creators and their created beings remain as compelling today as they were 5,000 years ago. The fundamental tension between human utility and human dignity that drives Mesopotamian divine politics reflects our ongoing contemporary debates about the nature of consciousness, free will, and moral responsibility. Modern discussions regarding artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and human enhancement echo the ancient concerns about the proper and sustainable relationship between creators and their creations. As we develop increasingly sophisticated abilities to modify genetic codes and create artificial forms of consciousness, the ancient questions about divine responsibility and creative ethics become directly relevant to our own contemporary decision-making. The Mesopotamian exploration of these themes provides a vital historical perspective on the moral complexities that arise when intelligent beings possess the power to create and destroy other forms of consciousness, ensuring that these ancient narratives will continue to influence human thought and culture for many generations to come.